it's hard to give a definitive answer about how the United States entered into the Great Depression and how the United States dealt with the Great Depression, because it still has a lot of effect on American politics today. And so there's different political viewpoints that speak about the Great Depression and the New Deal differently today. Generally speaking, the Democrats look to the New Deal as kind of a beacon and as a blueprint for government, and Republicans look at the New Deal as a slide towards socialism, right? So I'll actually, you'll probably figure out that I have a little bit of bias in that, but the main thing is to let you know that there is that argument that some people are still very much against the New Deal. I think that you may or may not remember the last Speaker of the House. His name was Paul Ryan, right? And he said that since he was in college, it had been his ambition to dismantle the New Deal. Okay. So it really shows us that it's still something that's prevalent in American politics. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a kind of a 50,000 foot overview, an airplane view of it. I'm not going to try to go into the different things that happen, because it's very complex. All right. But I think we can get a good feeling for how the Great Depression started by looking at this diagram that I made. Okay. Notice that the diagram is called the Great Debt Balloon. All right. So I would mention to you guys that if you're going to take notes on this diagram, make sure you draw the balloon in there. Okay. Because the balloon's going to be important. All right. Questions, comments? All right. Let's think back then to the end of World War I. What was the document that ended World War I?
The Treaty of Versailles.
Right, the Treaty of Versailles. Okay. Now, the Treaty of Versailles, as we mentioned last week when we talked about it, was ended up being a punitive treaty, right? Meaning that Britain and France were concerned to make sure that Germany was never able to threaten them again, and so they made punitive provisions in the document, like dividing Germany up, like taking away part of its industrial heartland, and also imposing on Germany reparations. All right. The argument was that Germany was forced to concede that they were fully responsible for the war, and therefore they should be fully responsible for paying for the war. The problem with that was, Germany wasn't fully responsible for the war, but the other part of it was that when they signed the treaty, what the treaty said was, okay, you owe us reparations for the full cost of the war, but we haven't figured out what that is yet, so we'll let you know later. Right? We'll send you a bill. And they did, right? But the problem with the bill was enormous. And it was meant to be that way because it was meant to keep the German economy crippled so that they could no longer threaten Britain and France. You guys are following me here? Questions, comments? All right. Okay. Now let's think about the Treaty of Versailles. What was the American reaction to the Treaty of Versailles? You guys remember?
Wasn't it hard to ratify it first because the Senate didn't want it at first?
It was at first, and also what? Forever. The United States never ratified.
Right. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
The United States didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which meant that the United States wasn't owed reparations by Germany because it wasn't part of the treaty, right? And the United States signed a separate treaty with all the different warring powers that the United States was at war with. Okay, but during the war, Britain and France had gone deeply into debt. Okay. The reason for this is because, unlike what most people believe, that war is good for the economy, actually, war is terrible for the economy. And the reason why was because after about a year and a half of war, Britain and France ran out of money. And then but they still wanted to prosecute the war. And that meant they still needed to buy things to prosecute the war. And so what they did was they borrowed money. And where they borrowed the money from was in the United States. Now, they didn't borrow money from the American government, but they borrowed money from corporations in the United States. You guys follow what I'm saying here? All right. So what that meant was that at the end of the war, Britain and France were deep in debt to the United States, and Germany was deep in debt to Britain and France. Okay. You guys follow me here? All right. So now, because the United States had been allied with Britain and France at the end of the war, Britain and France thought that the United States shouldn't force them to pay their debts. But the debts weren't owed to the United States. The debts were owed to American corporations. And so it would be kind of like me saying, well, I got a cousin that works at Capital One, so I shouldn't have to pay for my credit card, right? But that's not how it works, okay? And so Britain and France were forced to pay back their loans that they'd paid to the United States. Let me just mention here, right? We talked about how many people believe that war is good for the economy, right? But what had happened was that Britain and France had invested huge amounts of money in war material. What's wrong with that?
You can only use them for war.
Right. You use it for war, and then what happens to war material generally?
It gets destroyed.
It's sold.
It gets destroyed, right? I mean, that's the whole point of war, is to break things, right? So the point here is that Britain and France are investing huge amounts of money on stuff that's going to be destroyed. Okay. It would be kind of like if you decided to go down to Mission Valley and buy an Escalade, right? Borrow, say, $50,000 to buy an Escalade, and then drove the Escalade off the end of the pier, right? At the end, you wouldn't have an Escalade, but you would have what? A debt, right? You'd have a huge debt that you had to pay for something that no longer existed. So that would be very much like taking your money and putting it in a trash can and lighting it on fire. You see what I'm saying? And that's the problem then with the idea that war is good for the economy. War is always bad for the economy because war destroys the national resources. Okay, the only people that war is good for are arms merchants, essentially, right? Arms merchants make a killing. People that can make money off selling things to people that are making war will make a killing, literally and figuratively. But the country itself will always go into debt. So the economy never, I should say, the country never benefits from going to war. It's always bad news, right? Economically. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments? Okay, so all right, at any rate, we have Britain and France owing huge amounts of money to the United States. And we have Germany owing huge amounts of money to Britain and France. And Americans insist that Britain and France have to pay up. So Britain and France then will insist that Germany has to pay up. Okay. The one thing about this whole situation is that all of the industrial economies in the world, except the United States, had collapsed, right? So Britain and France didn't have any money, and they didn't have any way to make money. Germany didn't have any money, and it didn't have any way to make any money. Essentially, all the money in the world was in the United States. Okay. And so Britain and France say to Germany, you better pay up or else we're going to invade Germany. Germany doesn't have any money, doesn't have any way of making any money. So if you owe a debt and you don't have any money, what do?
They print more money.
Well, printing money doesn't work. They did.
Well, no, yeah,
they
I know
did
that.
do that.
That's what they do, though.
printing money doesn't work. So if you're really going to pay back what you owe, then how are you going to get the money? Well, you can't rob a bank, right?
You have to get loans from other
Right.
countries.
Okay, you have to get loans. Now, in this scenario, if I'm Germany, who am I going to borrow money from?
The people with all the money, the U.S.
The United
US.
States, exactly. And what happens is that the United States passes laws making it legal to lend money to Germany. So the United States corporations are lending money to Germany, who are paying reparations to Britain and France, who take that money and pay it back in war loan payments to corporations in the United States. So corporations in the United States are making a killing because they're getting interest on the loans to Germany and interest on the loans to Britain and France. You guys are all with me? Questions, comments? Okay. And the reason why this works is because of the bull market. All right. Now, what does that mean? A bull market is when the prices on the stock market continue to rise. Okay. The prices on the stock market continue to rise. Well, what does that mean? And just bear with me here for a second, because I want to try and draw a picture for you guys. Okay. So when you're thinking about the stock market, there's two different numbers that you think of. You think of price and value. And price is what the stock, what you're willing to pay for the stock. Value is what the stock's actually worth. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the price and value of stocks on the American stock market over a period of time, which is the 1920s. So we're going to do that with a graph. This is going to be the money going up, and then going this way is going to be time. So we could say, okay, starting in 1920, and we're just going to put a couple other dates here, 1927 and 1929. So now over this period of time, we see the price of the stocks going up and up and up and up until about 1927. Then it's going to level off. But at the same time, we're going to see the value of the stocks increase, but at a much lower rate. And the significance of this is that the people are paying more for the stock than it's actually worth. Well, why would you do that? Well, it's because of enthusiasm. That's why they call it a bull market. It's not based on science so much as it is on what people's expectations are. So the expectation is that the price is going to keep going up and up and up and up. But in about 1927, people realized, wait a minute, we're paying way too much for this stock, and then it'll level off. And then in 1929, there is what's called a market correction, where the value moves to equal the price. And so what happens then is that now the price and the value of the stock are the same, but the stock was overvalued. So that the money that people, that was represented for people in the stock is going to disappear. Okay,
So
it's going to be gone.
So Professor, sorry to interrupt, but the top line is the price and the bottom line is the value of the
Right.
stock.
Right, price and value. Okay, and so the idea here is that they're paying more for the stock than it's actually worth. I don't know if you guys remember in 2008 with the housing crisis. The problem with the housing crisis was that people were paying more for the houses than they were worth. When it became obvious that that was happening, the price of the houses dropped to equal the value, which meant that a lot of people's money that had been invested just disappeared. Now think about when we watched that movie about the 20s, and we heard they were talking about investing on margin. What is investing on margin? Well, essentially what it meant was if you wanted to buy a certain amount of stock, you would only have to pay for 10% of that stock. So let's say you wanted to buy $1,000 worth of stock, you would only have to put up $100. Well, why would that work? Well, the reason why that would work, well, first off, let me just ask you this. On the day that you purchase that stock, you would get a stock certificate saying that you had $1,000, but you had only put up $100. So how much real value do you have?
hundred
$100.
dollars worth of stock.
No. Because if somebody calls that stock,
Oh, $1,000 worth of stock, but the price is only 100.
right, so how much money do you actually have?
$1,000?
No. That's what it looks like you have. But what you really have is,
Is a tenth, like a tenth of
no,
whatever the value is?
no, it's minus $900. You are in debt, right? When you
Oh,
buy the
because you're
stock,
really buying a loan, basically, or like a short-term loan.
Oh, that
right?
makes
So,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. And so what happens then, the reason why that works is if the price keeps going up, eventually the price will match the value of the amount of money that you actually paid, or that the face value of the stock, let's put it that way. And then after that, anything you make is profit. But the day that you buy it, you're not actually buying stock, you're actually creating debt. You really owe money. So let's just leave it at that, and let's keep this in mind. All of this money between the price and the value, much of which is not real. It's representing debt. All of this money, when the stock market crashes, so to speak, the the market correction causes the price and the value to equal each other. All that money disappears. What we were just talking about was the bull market, right? Remember we said that all the money in the United States was in the all the money in the world was in the United States. At the money that was in the United States, much of it was there because of the bull market, right? And the bull market meant that prices kept going up and up and up and up, right? What happens if the prices? What happens if the market changes from a bull market to a bear market? Bear market is when the prices are going down, right? Meaning that people are losing money, and what that really meant was all of that imaginary money that was there is no longer there, right? So what that means then is that the system here relies on there being money in the United States that can be loaned to Germany, that can be paid to Britain and France, that can be paid back to the U.S. But if there isn't any money in the U.S., then this whole system collapses, right? You follow what I'm saying here? And that's why I call it the great debt balloon, because the bull market is the fire that's keeping the balloon inflated and floating, but it's hot air. It's not real. And when when the fire goes out, the whole thing collapses. Okay, this money that was being invested, that was being loaned, right, was mostly by banks. Okay, where does the bank get its money?
Investors, American
By
investors, people.
depositors, right? So let's say that I have $100 and I put it in the bank, and then the bank pays me interest so that they can use my money, and they take my money, my $100, and they buy $1,000 worth of stock, and they loan that because it looks like now they've got $1,000, so they loan that to Germany, right? And so what we see then is that most of this money isn't real. What happens when the balloon crashes? What happens? Does the bank have enough money to pay off all of its debts?
No.
No.
It lost all that money, right? So it actually has said that it had more money than it actually did. And Americans aren't stupid. They realize, okay, look, the banks have been reckless with my money. I better go down and get it. And so they had what they call runs on the bank, right? People would run down to the bank and they'd stand in line and take out all their money. Okay. But what happens if you're the guy that's in line behind the last guy that gets money?
Don't get any money.
You don't get any money. The technical term for that is you're screwed, right? Because if you don't get any money, you're just out of luck. There isn't any place to turn. It's all gone. You guys get what I'm saying? Okay, and this is going to be then that what this is going to do is it's going to cause a lot of people to lose any kind of savings that they may have had which was the only safety net there was in the United States at the time. If you were out of money, you couldn't go on welfare, right? You were just out of luck. Okay, you get what I'm saying here. And this is going to be what causes a lot of people to decide to move. They're going to say, I can't make any money here. I got to go somewhere else. Let's go to California, right? You get what I'm saying, right? Okay, so now let's say then that the bank doesn't have any money. The banking system essentially collapses, right? Well, how is that going to end up causing a Great Depression? Well, the reason why is because manufacturing relies on the banking system. If you're a manufacturer, it's kind of like farming, really. If you're a manufacturer, then you go to the bank and you borrow money, and then you use that money to hire workers and to buy machinery and resources. You build a product, and then you sell the product, and then you take the money that you got from selling the product, you pay back the bank, and then anything left over is your profit. Okay, but where does the whole cycle start? The whole process started at the bank, right? The manufacturers go to the bank for what? What do they go to the bank to get? Capital, right? And if the banking system collapses, that means there is no capital, right? If there's no capitalism, you can't, excuse me, if there's no capital, you can't have capitalism. You can't have capitalism without capital. You guys get what I'm saying here? That if there's no money in the economy, you can't do anything. You can't manufacture anything. And because of that, then there's going to be high unemployment, right? You guys are following me here? And let's go even further than that, because we've already said that all of the industrial countries of the world had collapsed, right? And when those economies collapsed, do you guys remember us talking about dependency theory? When we talked about imperialism, what is dependency theory?
It's like some countries are dependent on others for resources and capital?
Right, exactly. There's two groups of countries, the metropolis and the periphery, right? The metropolis is a monarch country and the periphery is colonized economies, right? And when the economy of the metropolis collapses, what happens to the economy of the periphery?
They also collapsed because they were dependent on the metropolis?
Exactly. That's why they call it dependency, okay? And so we see then the entire world capitalist economy collapses, all right? And really, this was a death blow to capitalism, right? Capitalism essentially is dead everywhere, okay? But now let's think about this. There's one country, one major country in the world where the economy didn't collapse. Does anybody want to guess where that is? Well, what country do you think is not a capitalist country?
United States.
No, the United States economy did collapse.
Russia?
The Soviet Union, exactly, because remember the Soviets have had a communist revolution, so they're not in the capitalist system anymore, right? Okay, so what will happen then is that capitalism essentially is dead, and the Soviet Union's economy didn't collapse. So the Soviet Union will use that as a propaganda tool to say, look, socialism really works because our economy didn't collapse, even though all the capitalist economies collapsed. You guys follow what I'm saying here? But there's a big problem with that. And the big problem is that the economy in the Soviet Union didn't collapse because it had already collapsed during the revolution and it never recovered, right? And so when they said our economy didn't collapse, it didn't collapse because it couldn't collapse. There was no place for it to collapse to. It was already dead, okay? All right, but what will happen then is many people in the rest of the world will start to say, yeah, you know, socialism might not be such a bad idea. People like, for example, Upton Sinclair, right? And other people like W.B. Du Bois, who we talked about, all right, will start to say, look, maybe socialism is not such a bad idea after all.